Groups.
Great. We are here live now on our panel, so I want to welcome our three guests and to all the viewers now tuning in to this panel, Iraq and Other Wars, the Challenges and Risks of Reporting from the Field. My name is Eva Salinas. I'm the managing editor of the Canadian International Council and our website, OpenCanada.org, where many of you are tuning into this discussion today. On Monday, the House of Commons, a House of Commons vote approved a revised military mission in the Middle East, essentially extending our mission in Iraq and expanding into Syria. This is effective now till March 30th, 2016, and is part of the larger coalition war against Islamic militants, Islamic State militants, often referred to as ISIS or ISIL. Essentially, this means the Canadian military could effectively begin strikes in Syria immediately, and if we did so, we'd be the only coalition state in joining the U.S. in military action outside of Iraq. This is all part of Operation Impact, which actually began in October in Iraq, and some of those on our panel have been there. But there have been very few media reports, and as now this campaign is sure to continue at least a year, and it being an election year as well in Canada, we have a few questions around what to expect in terms of the media coverage, what the challenges will be, what are risks for journalists who may be going into the field, and how do these challenges compare when we look at past coverage of wars that the Canadian military have been involved, but war coverage in general. So to help answer some of these questions, I want to welcome three veteran journalists here with us today. For those viewing, feel free to send your comments and your questions to the panelists using the hashtag CICIraq, and we'll get to some of those questions towards the end of the preliminary discussion here. So first I want to welcome Michael Petrou, who is a senior writer from Maclean's magazine. Michael has covered conflict in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Central Asia. Louie Palu is an award-winning photojournalist, and he's known for his international work, most recently in Afghanistan and even more recently in Mexico. So welcome, Louie. And last but not least is Saša Petricic, who is the CBC TV's Middle Eastern correspondent, and he has reported from Syria, from the civil war in Syria, from Egypt, from recently in Afghanistan, and more recently from Iraq. So welcome, Saša. So let's dive right into it. I guess, Michael, I want to start with you because you were in Iraq in October. And it seems that there are two parts to this coverage, and there will be going forward. There are the details of the Canadian military campaign, so how much it's costing, the actions of our troops, equipment that we're sending over, and then there's the wider context, the threat of ISIS in general to communities on the ground, the international response, the historical details. When you went in October, how did you find these challenges in covering these two aspects? Because your reports that came out of it, including a large feature inside Canada's New War, covered all of that. But there are two sets of challenges, aren't there, in covering those two aspects? How did you find those challenges differing?
Well, the Iraqi and I guess the Syrian angle was a lot easier to cover because when I was there, and as far as I'm aware, to the present day as well, Canada wasn't providing any access to Canadian soldiers that are active in northern Iraq. So I could talk to Iraqis about the mission, and I spoke to everyone from Iraqi displaced people to Syrian refugees to Peshmerga soldiers. I could visit some of the areas where they were fighting and where coalition airstrikes had taken place. I mean, I could get a fairly good picture of what was happening on the ground in northern Iraq and how it was affecting people that lived there and fight there, but only very indirectly, by talking to Iraqi and Iraqi Kurdish officials could I have any sense of what the Canadians and other international forces were doing. They just weren't providing the access. There was nothing like the embedding program that happened in Afghanistan. So that, I mean, there have been folks who have been trying to cover Canada's mission from Kuwait, but kind of Canada's footprint on the ground in northern Iraq was simply not something that I could directly cover when I was there, which was frustrating.
And Saša, you were covering the mission from Kuwait. Can you tell us about the challenges you encountered there? How difficult or open you found the campaign to be?
Yes, I was there in Kuwait basically from the moment that the Canadian air effort arrived for about 2 weeks after that, 2.5 weeks after that. Kuwait is where Canada's CF-18s are based. It's where we have 2 aerial refuelers and 1 surveillance aircraft based. It is actually inside a Kuwaiti base, which is then, I guess, under the control of the Kuwaitis. And then inside that you have an American base, which is under the control of the Americans. And then Canada is embedded in the middle of that. It is obviously a challenge to get into it. Until I had arrived, the Kuwaitis actually were trying to insist that the information that it was actually being based there not be made public, that it could be in some other Gulf state, perhaps. But by the time I arrived there, pretty much everybody knew that it was in Kuwait. Canada was pretty much saying that it would be willing to allow media access to their operation, but that they had to negotiate that with the Kuwaitis. They started negotiating. While I was there, nothing happened. We had no access whatsoever, and there is still no access to that base. They are saying it is because of the Kuwaitis, and I think that is a large part of the issue. But I also get the impression that it's kind of convenient for the Canadian forces that journalists are kept out, perhaps for the same reasons that that Michael couldn't get at the soldiers on the ground. There would be fewer reasons to keep people away. Here, there's an excuse, for want of a better word, and but I think that it's handy, because all the information then, not only does it not come firsthand from journalists, it doesn't even come really mostly from the people who are on the ground in Kuwait. Most of the information actually has to come from Ottawa, from these various press briefings. So it's filtered in a myriad of ways before it ever comes out, and nobody ever lays eyes on the planes or the pilots or the other people that Canada has over there.
You have to wonder, too, it being an election year, how much of that access is going to be dependent on domestic politics. For instance, if the government sees the campaign is going well, will there be more access and promotion of coverage? If not, are we going to see a turn towards a focus to domestic issues within the election coverage? If you can remind us, Louie, in Afghanistan, did you see that happening at all? Did you see access change depending on certain political issues? Can you remind us just what kind of access journalists had in Afghanistan?
Well, the access in 2006 compared to the access in 2010 was like, from the Earth to the moon. It was very, very different. My role in terms of what I want to get to, everybody wants to get as close as possible, but all my photographs are taken like 5 to 10 feet away from everything. So for me, it's like a waiting game. There's no surprise. Every government in the history of any war are going to try and control how close media gets, or they learn from the previous war and then change the access. But a lot of the reporting I did in Afghanistan that I got Canadians to read about, and not skirting the issue of wanting to deal with the access to Canadian troops, is I featured Afghans a lot. And I think it is still very difficult, but for me, look, a flight to Erbil is $1,500, right, from almost anywhere in North America. So for me, I'm just playing a waiting game, right? Sometimes it's legacy, I could do a great story on what Canada did in Kandahar by going back there now when they're not there anymore and still talk about it. So, yes, I would love to have access to the military. Yes, I have put some requests in. Will I get it? I don't know, but I've been asked to go to Syria and Iraq by different people to cover the wars there. And, in Afghanistan, it's a patience game. I think the war going on over there and what's happening with ISIS is not going to end overnight. And I think the surprise is, if in 2006 you're going to tell me we'd be still in that combat mission in 2010 or 11, and the way it would have unfolded, none of us could have ever predicted things were going to go, they were going to go. So for me, it's a waiting game. That's what I'm waiting for right now. So, and it's it's about just keeping my finger on the pulse. I'm daily in touch with people up in northern Iraq, and I'm waiting for that right moment to go. So that's sort of where I'm sitting, because things do change.
Mm-hmm. And Michael, what about the security considerations for journalists? How does this differ? You know, we're talking about, you know, likely beyond Iraq. We're talking about a completely different group than what was the war in Afghanistan. What are some of the differences there? Is this riskier for journalists? Do you think that is a deterrent, or do you think we're going to see more coverage happening from Ottawa, for instance, because of that?
Look, it certainly is a deterrent. And I mean, this gets a little bit tricky to talk about because I mean there are logistical obstacles, I guess, surrounding insurance, for example. For example, I mean, my last trip to northern Iraq originally I had originally planned to include a brief foray into some of the Kurdish-controlled areas of northeastern Syria, and couldn't do that because of some of these concerns. And the repercussions of that are consequential. I mean, it means that, for example, a lot of the Syrian coverage has been done by freelancers who are not bound by some of the restrictions of major media organizations, but by the same token don't have the same sort of protection that major insurers might provide. That matters. That matters a lot. It affects the outside view of how the war is interpreted, because it funnels or it narrows the sort of reporting that we're getting there. Then again, I mean, the fact that some of these logistical things are difficult to talk about means that perhaps some freelancers aren't fully aware of the risks, and that has a snowballing effect. So it gets very, and then of course there's the ethical considerations for major news organizations that now have the option of perhaps accepting copy from very dangerous places in parts of the world where they haven't assumed the risk of sending their own staff reporters for whom they have responsibility, fiduciary responsibility in terms of money and insurance. So I mean, all these things are very consequential. We don't talk about it as openly as we should, and there's some reasons for that, but it's still frustrating. It matters. I mean, and it matters that we're getting perhaps because of the dangers, because of the logistical risks, it affects the coverage coming out of places like Syria and of places like Iraq. So yes, I mean, it absolutely matters. I mean, for me in October, you know, we made the decision that the risks were acceptable in Iraq. So I was able to report from there, and I'm glad I did. But by the same token, I was reporting not solely from the north. My driver was able to get us quite a bit farther south of Kirkuk, but even then, it was, you know, I was operating in a part of the country where the risks were acceptable to me. And there are other stories that simply don't get reported on because they're high, including, unless we forget, and we often do, for local risks. And many Iraqis and Syrians have suffered pursuing their journalism as well. So it does restrict the picture, and it does massage and change the picture that we get of those conflicts here.
Mm-hmm. Saša, you're based in the Middle East. You're joining us from Jerusalem today. So much of your reporting is field reporting. If we're talking about the role of field reports here in our understanding of this war, how do you find that balance then of something that's still possible and safe for you to do, but is going to give you know, that extra insight into the war? So if, for instance, journalists in Ottawa are trying to get more details of the Canadian military campaign, what's the importance then? I mean, I think we would know, but I just want to hear it from you in terms of what do you think going forward this year, that those field reports, are they still necessary, and what context will they fulfill?
Well, I think they're crucial. I think they're crucial not just specifically in terms of watching and seeing what Canadians are doing, although they might answer some of the questions that have been raised, for instance, in briefings in Ottawa. You know, when Canadians, when a Canadian soldier is killed by friendly fire, how can that happen? Well, at this point, we have a very sketchy idea of how that could have happened. When they talk about, you know, we have advisors there who are playing a role in advising the Peshmerga, training the Peshmerga, but they're not really on the front line, but they're kind of on the front line, but they might be under fire and they might have to fire back, but we're really not in a combat role. I don't know what that means, and I don't know what that means until I actually go there and see how they are operating. And I think that there are journalists, Michael included, who you know, have been willing to go and see that, but haven't had the opportunity. There's no question this is an extremely dangerous place to cover, especially Iraq, many parts of Iraq. The area around Erbil, the area that's under the control of the Peshmerga, was less dangerous when I went there, and that was earlier last year. In the summertime, it became more dangerous after that. Things shift. Syria right now, outside of Damascus, Damascus itself is dangerous to some extent, but you know, outside of Damascus is basically, there's very few even major news organizations with all the resources that they could put into it who are willing to take the risk of going in there. You know, when I was in Aleppo, when I was in the area north of Aleppo, those areas were still under the control of the Free Syrian Army, and it was a whole totally different game. The al-Nusra Front, ISIS, the Islamic State, they weren't playing the role that they were now. There wasn't the same kind of conflict that there was between these different groups. And frankly, the value or the idea of kidnapping journalists, which has now become a bit of a fad, and frankly a moneymaker for these organizations, hadn't really been as big a problem as it is right now. Your bigger problem was probably being arrested by the Syrian government if you were in Syria as a journalist with the opposition. So all these things change, but Syria has become incredibly dangerous, and frankly, you know, unless you read what freelancers are writing and perhaps some of the wire services, we really don't know what's happening on the ground in Syria from an independent perspective. We have a general idea, and there are some people who really follow this closely through Syrians who are in there and who are, in some cases, at risk to themselves getting information out. But frankly, we don't have independent journalists out there who, and certainly not Canadians, who are feeding back information to give us the context within which Canada is operating. I just want to add one more quick thing, and that is that, frankly, you know, you got to wonder also where the Canadian government is getting its information about what's going on in Syria and in Iraq. You know, it's not like Canada has independent eyes on the ground in most of these places, and I've had Canadian diplomats ask me, okay, you were in Syria, what was it like? What actually happened there? What's happening on the ground? I know that they want to get information from as many sources as they can, but frankly, I get the impression that they don't have a lot of sources.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And it's interesting, too, looking back from, we mentioned 2006 in Afghanistan, and you know, within the past 10 years in foreign coverage, a lot has changed. We have less foreign bureaus. We have a lot of journalists using technology, social media, from, you know, those who are local on the ground. Usually those tend to be those, you know, obviously with access to technology or educated English speaking. So the way we get our information is different, and that includes journalists as well. Louie, you also mentioned one thing we haven't brought up, and that is, you know, even wrapping your head around such a complex conflict is one thing, but there's also the emotional and physical toll on a journalist, and certainly, you know, we can't just send anyone. You know, there are challenges as well to what can result from reports when we send someone and we see, for instance, I mean, Vice is really at the front lines here all the time, and that seems to be more of the norm. So Louis, what you now have covered Mexico quite extensively. Were some of these things considered in that decision? Would you go back to the Middle East? What affected you from Afghanistan and some of those?
Yeah. So my bag's packed for Iraq or Syria. Syria is probably going to be a no. I've had a lot of people offer me a lot of money to go into Syria because of my experience. That's pretty much a no. I'm with Saša on that. It's a black hole for even the people who should be in the know of what's going on there. Iraq is very much in my planning. Sort of, I have my bag ready to go. But with Mexico, you know, people don't think of war when they think of Mexico, but I think I covered more murders or assassinations in my first month in Mexico than in my first 2 or 3 years in Afghanistan. It was like, I think I covered 26 assassinations in one day. Mm-hmm. And these are professional hits. And these are like professional military style hits. And what's interesting is, as much as I think something needs to happen with regards to ISIS doing what they're doing and causing the chaos and the horror that they are in the world, hey, Mexican drug cartels affect more Canadians than ISIS does, actually. And, you know, the RCMP and the police are kind of fighting that war in the streets of Canada, but cocaine, heroin, and meth and all the organized crime that's associated with the cartels in Mexico, and the over 120,000 people killed in Mexico as a direct result is from drug smuggling from Mexico up through the United States and Canada. It's not talked about a lot, and I think what Saša's getting at, and I think what the point is who's steering the message of where we should be looking and where we shouldn't be looking, and what independent reporting is going on, so that voters and policymakers can look to people like us, independent witnesses, independent voices, to form their opinions about what's going on in the world and where a government's foreign policy should be made. That, I think, is what Saša was talking about, and I want to kind of back up as well, is there need to be independent eyes on the ground, not just because we're journalists and we want access, but because it helps the actual politicians putting the policy in place, because they may not actually be in control of all the information they're getting as well, and it may be unclear. So I think it benefits everybody. You know, I think the most advanced societies in the history of our world has always had a free, strong media. So that's what I kind of support, and I think it benefits the policy of the current government in place to have independent eyes on the ground, because we see things coming that they don't. You know, I'd been covering hearings on ISIS a year ago in Washington, D.C., when people didn't even know what ISIS was. You know, they still kept calling it Al-Qaeda, and I'm like, wow, this is scary. And it didn't really hit us till they beheaded James Foley, the American journalist. That's when it hit the mainstream public, and that video was like a terrorist attack. It scared everybody. It certainly scared me, especially because, you know, James Foley's in sort of our group of colleagues as journalists. We're being directly targeted now. And sort of that's what I'd add to is, so anyone watching this program, what are you focusing on and what are you not seeing? That's the question you need to ask when you're reading the news. Because there's always something missing from the news, right? So Mexico's in NAFTA with Canada, and they literally have a drug war going on, but our focus is all in the Middle East. Is that what we want? And I think that that's what people need to ask themselves when they go to the polls or when they watch the news. What do they want more of? You know, what do they want less of, and why?
That's a great segue to likely our last major question here in this discussion is going forward between now and the election, or now and the end of March, when, you know, who knows where we'll be at that point, but what are the most important questions that the media is going to try and answer in your view, both to inform voters, as you said, Louis, but in this coverage, and that includes the challenges that the media is going to have to overcome or look to overcome when reporting on this. Saša, what do you think will be the most important questions on this military campaign, but also the war in general?
Sorry, you're asking me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, we went out of the regular routine. Well, what are the main questions? I mean, I think just to add to something that we just said, you know, it's not just the politicians. I mean, in our democratic system, it's the general public that really needs to know what's going on there too. Maybe not in detail, not on a daily basis, but if you're asking members of parliament who have never been in the Middle East, who to vote on whether we should be sending more troops on the ground and basically waging war in yet another country. It's not just them and the government that needs to know about this, but they need to have some sort of backing or advice or be able to get a sense of it from their constituents. And if Canadians don't know what's going on, then that I think that's a huge problem. Again, most Canadians aren't going to know on a daily basis. It may not even affect how they vote. Foreign policy issues rarely affect Canadian elections. So, but when crucial votes like this are held and crucial decisions are made, you would hope that that Canadians and certainly members of Parliament from areas where they don't have that kind of foreign policy background would have some understanding of what's going on. And where are they going to get it? Well, they might go to think tanks, they might go to experts, but most often the most readily accessible information is going to come from journalists. And if journalists can't go out there and get it, then that's a problem. What are the important questions we need to be asking? Well, I think we need to be asking in terms of this area, where is all of this headed? As Louie points out, you've got to find out what new things are coming on the ground. The latest, boogeyman, the latest flavor, the latest target is ISIS. But this is an area with a lot of people that have a lot of agendas that we do not agree with. We didn't agree with Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, a little while back, and we wanted him removed. We haven't heard that being talked about very much anymore. What happens if we do defeat ISIS? What is left in those areas? What's left in Iraq? What's left in Syria? Do we go back to saying that, okay, now we have to also defeat Assad, who we haven't really decided that we're going to go against anyway? And in fact, as recently as a few months ago, the Prime Minister was saying that this is someone that we don't want to target because, well, we don't really know who would be in his place if he was removed, and it's a very complicated area. Well, the area is just as complicated. In fact, it's even more complicated than it used to be, but we have chosen one particular target because Washington has, perhaps, because there's an international coalition that we want to join, perhaps, because we really think that these people are a threat to Canada, perhaps. I don't know which of those is really the main reason why we are going after all of this, because the answers to those questions, there's a number of answers to those questions. Who in the Middle East is the biggest threat to Canada? Well, we could have an hour-long discussion or longer even just on that question. And perhaps the biggest threat to Canada, as Louie says, is not in the Middle East. So those are questions that need to be asked. And why are we part of this particular effort and not other efforts against others that we don't like, don't agree with, or who we think are doing things that are either morally wrong or bad for the populations that they have that they have under them? The Syrian government has created the biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War. There are millions of people that I've seen and talked to in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Turkey, who have been misplaced, who have lost parents, children, etc., who have been victims of barrel bombs and other things that are less spectacular but no less devastating. And most of that has not been the result of ISIS. So how do we decide which of these things are actually going to be our priority? And I'm not clear. I don't know how the Canadian government makes that decision. I don't think they've described it or explained it very well.
Great. Well, I'm going to leave it at that, and I want to thank all three of you for joining us here today. As it is an election year and it is a large military campaign now extended for a year, we will be covering this all year. So look forward to your reports and safe reporting to all of you. So thanks again to our three panelists, and for those viewing, OpenCanada.org.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.